All right, well, welcome to the first session of this year's Technology and Society Forum. Special thanks to Jay Capraff. Jay, where are you? Jay is the impresario of these events that, I don't know, Jay, they've been going on for several years now. This must be the 10th year, right. Well, welcome to all of you who are here with us today. It's also we're approaching a significant anniversary. We're almost 12 months out from Hurricane Sandy, which occurred the latter portion of last October. The focus of this afternoon's event, for which we have three wonderful and distinguished speakers, is Hurricane Sandy, Impact, Recovery, and Preparedness. I've been asked to be the moderator of this event. For those who don't know me, I'm Maury Cohen. I am the director, among other things, I'm the director of the program in Science, Technology, and Society here at NJIT. Anybody who has any interest in that, I always travel with some promotional brochures, and always glad to give those out for anybody who might have an interest. I teach courses here at NJIT in the politics of sustainability. I consider myself to be, in one way or another, an environmental or sustainability social scientist. And I think that perhaps gives me some interesting point of access to talk about or to introduce the topic that's going to be taken up here today. Let me first introduce our three speakers, and then I'll go on to try to provide a few introductory words to try to frame what we're going to hear this afternoon. First, we're delighted to have here as a special guest Dr. Tom Hodson, who joins us from the Army Corps of Engineers. He's based in the New York office and serves as the Chief of Plan Formulation. He is well equipped to join us here today. He has a PhD in economics, a JD law degree in law. He teaches on a adjunct basis at Fairleigh Dickinson, so is has familiarity in speaking in these sorts of venues. He is most notably working these days on what's known as the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, which is a post-Hurricane Sandy assessment of the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. Also with us today, two members of the NJIT faculty. First, sitting in the center is Michel Boufadel, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and also on his right is Tom D'Alessio, who joins us and may be familiar also to a number of you, member of the faculty at NJIT's College of Architecture and Design, and is also now the director of the Center for Resilient Design, based in the School of Architecture. So let me try to tee up what we're going to be listening to over the next hour and a half. As a social scientist, I pay very close attention to issues of language, because language can tell us a lot about how political configurations are developing, and language isn't just accidental. Words do mean something. And one thing that I've noticed in the last 11 and a half months since Hurricane Sandy, that especially here in New Jersey, there's been a discursive change that has occurred, that it was a little bit more common to hear people use the term sustainability when thinking about New Jersey futures, and that's less so the case, most notably that the term resilience has come to occupy a lot of the political and social space that was previously occupied by the term sustainability. I have my own theories as to why that may be the case, but I encourage you to listen to how our speakers use language and the way in which, in particular, they use the term sustainability and resilience. As for myself, it's rather difficult to picture Governor Christie speaking about sustainability, but those of you who have who follow his travels around the state have probably come to realize that he has no problem talking about resilience. Relatedly, I'd also like you to encourage you to think about the difference between weak and strong sustainability, or weak and strong resilience. Weak sustainability or weak resilience is largely about improvements in technological efficiencies. It's about creating opportunities for so-called win-win or win-win-win kinds of solutions. And it's about sort of creating the conditions to enable business as usual to carry on and perpetuate itself into the foreseeable future. In contrast, strong sustainability, among other things, is about trying to move us to a different place. It's about achieving not just incremental improvements in how we organize and facilitate our lives. It's not necessarily so agreeable. It suggests that change may be difficult to achieve, may even grate on certain political sensibilities. It's also about transition. Again, transition to a different mode of social and perhaps even economic organization. And so finally, and then I'll throw things over to our first speaker, since I'm talking about transition, I encourage you to be attentive as well to the differences between resilience and transition. This has become a big point of debate within sustainability studies and sustainability science. And it speaks to some sort of larger issues about how we think about the future, what it means to engage in future-oriented planning, and by its nature, all planning is future-oriented. And also, maybe of particular concern to you who hail from down the shore, about some of the plans and provisions that are currently being put into place in order to enhance the storm-proofedness, if you want to use that word, of our coastal communities in the future. So, Tom, let me kick it over to you. I think the protocol calls for about 20 minutes, and then we'll move things down the road to our colleagues further on down the line.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. As was mentioned earlier, I'm the Chief of Plan Formulation at New York District of the Corps of Engineers. What does that mean? That means that my staff of economists and engineers, archaeologists, biologists, a number of other professions. At one time I had a CPA on staff, prepare cost-benefit analysis of proposed water resources projects that fall within the Corps of Engineers' mission areas. The mission areas for the Corps that matter the most around here are deep draft navigation, aquatic ecosystem restoration, and flood risk management. North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study falls into that flood risk management mission. Now, before we go any further, I should say this. This study, North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, is different from the typical Corps of Engineers study. And in order to understand why it's being done the way it is, it might be quite helpful for you to have a few minutes of me talking Civil Works 101, how things normally go. The Corps of Engineers, at least the Civil Works part, there are really three corps of engineers. There's the military construction part, there's the regulatory part, you know, they enforce the Clean Water Act, for instance, and then there is Civil Works. Civil Works is different from the other parts of the Corps, different even from, I believe, every other federal agency, in that we are project funded. Everything that we do means that we've been able to convince a non-federal sponsor to engage our services. So in that sense, we're a lot more like a business than we are a government agency. Sandy, however, falls into a completely different category because it's 100% federally funded. And that changes fundamentally the way things are done. Normally, what happens is something bad happens. Water is not going where people want it to go, or is where people don't want it to be, and they write a letter to congressman, mayor, whomever, and then that becomes a proposal before Congress to get the Corps of Engineers involved in the form of a study. And it's a two-stage study process, a reconnaissance phase and a feasibility phase. The reconnaissance phase is focused on two things, really. Is this the kind of activity in which the Corps of Engineers can legally be a participant? And then the other part is, well, what's that feasibility study going to cost? Because the feasibility study is going to be cost shared. It's cost shared normally 50-50 with a non-federal sponsor. Principal non-federal sponsor in the state of New Jersey is the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection. New York, it's DEC. New York City, it's New York City EPA. Port Authority is another big non-federal sponsor. So those you can think of as our customers. Well, okay. So let's say we get through the reconnaissance phase. We find that dealing with this problem is something in which the Corps of Engineers can legally be involved, and we propose a feasibility study with a cost. They sign the contract. Now we're off and running to do the feasibility study. The feasibility study will compare and contrast all the different engineering ways of solving this water resources problem, whatever it is, whether it's lack of channel depth in New York Harbor, or the effects of Hurricane Sandy, or loss of environmental resources in Jamaica Bay, all things that I've been heavily involved in. We find through the cost-benefit process what's called the NED plan, the National Economic Development Plan, the plan that reasonably maximizes benefits in relationship to cost. And then that's the one that, except in some odd circumstances, we recommend to Congress. Congress then will decide whether to adopt the project, authorize it for construction, or not. Let's say that they do. What does that mean? That means that now we have to produce another contract with the non-federal sponsor, this time to construct the project that we have recommended. And again, that's going to be cost shared. They have to put their money up too. So let's say that that goes forward. Then and only then do you go to construction. And construction proceeds how? Construction proceeds really on the basis of the availability of appropriations from the non-federal side and from the federal side. Corps of Engineers can't spend a dollar without it being partly federal and partly non-federal. So that's the way things go normally. Normally, we're aimed towards figuring out what is the optimal project in this specific location, and it has a lot of engineering input. It has a lot of environmental regulation input. It has a lot of economic input. Sandy is different. The study area for Sandy is the entire North Atlantic coast, from the Canadian border to a small part of North Carolina. The entirety of what's really a Corps of Engineers command called North Atlantic Division. That's why it's called the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study. That's 31,000 miles of shoreline. That's hundreds of potential non-federal sponsors. There is absolutely no practical way on earth that we could run this study in the usual way. So, how do I get this to the next slide? Okay. So, here is the background. Hurricane Sandy happened in October of 2012, 28 to 30, 2012. It did affect the entire East Coast. In fact, it had effects going well into the Midwest. You had power outages in Ohio, for instance, that were Sandy-related. And it is also true that the biggest effect in terms of direct storm damage, I'm not talking about secondary effects like the wind knocking out power, but the direct storm damage, the effect of the storm surge on people and their places and effects, that was concentrated in the New York, New Jersey area. That reference there to Public Law 113-2 is the appropriation statute passed by Congress and signed by President Obama January 29th of this year, that provided the federal funding to do, among other things, this study. Many, many other things. It was a $60 billion measure. The Corps of Engineers didn't get the whole $60 billion, about 5.6 for the Corps of Engineers. So this one is showing you the official study area, which is every place that was affected by Hurricane Sandy. As you can see, that's quite huge. You know, the normal study area might be some town or a part of some town. Now we're talking about 11 states. So what can you do in this kind of context? What can you do with such a vast study area? Well, what we're supposed to be doing, according to the statute, is providing a framework for risk reduction to what are called vulnerable coastal areas. What does that mean? Well, what it comes down to mean as a practical matter is setting the basis for and doing a lot of the preliminary work on whatever feasibility studies non-federal sponsors may wish to sign up for post the Sandy Comprehensive. So what we're doing is setting up a way to compare and contrast the risk to this place, to that place, of a recurrence of Hurricane Sandy or some other storms. We never consider just one storm. Among the storms that are being considered is a Category 4 hurricane. Another one that's being considered is the one that FEMA uses for the standard of its insurance underwriting, which is called, right now, called ABF plus 3 in New York. BFA, base flood elevation, plus 3 in New York, plus 1 everywhere else. Why? Well, because New York state law says base flood elevation plus 3. So that means that's what they'll sign up to in a cost-shared project. So there's no sense studying something that they won't agree to cost share. And then number 2, this is a result of some testimony from Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Ms. Darcy, promote coastal resilient communities. Not required by the statute, but is now required because Ms. Darcy said it was, and told Congress that it would be. So, what will the study deliver? The strategy, which is the way to tell which places present the biggest opportunities for risk reduction per dollar, the second biggest, the third biggest, and then action plans. There's going to be an action plan for each state. Now, the fact that the Corps of Engineers comes with a suggested action plan doesn't mean that it's going to happen. Remember, everything that we do requires non-federal sponsor consent and also requires non-federal sponsor cost sharing unless there's some change in the law between now and when we deliver this study, which has to be before January 29th of 2015. And then within the comprehensive study are 9 sort of regional recons to further advance some subsequent feasibility study, should a non-federal sponsor appear that wants to do that. Okay, so another thing I've been asked to talk about is the effect that has been much discussed, particularly by Governor Christie, of having a Corps of Engineers project in place pre-Sandy as opposed to not having one in place. I asked around my friends in the different districts in North Atlantic Division, and the best example, the best comparison that I was able to find was Long Beach Island in New Jersey. Long Beach Island is a long coastal barrier island. It's within the territorial jurisdiction of Philadelphia District. So everything I'm about to show you came not from my staff, but came from Philadelphia District staff. And there is a Corps of Engineers congressionally authorized sand and dune project that covers the whole of Long Beach Island. But it's been constructed in pieces. Why has it been constructed in pieces? Well, remember, everything that the Corps of Engineers does in civil works requires non-federal sponsor support. We don't come in and say, we are the federales, we don't need no stinking badges. In fact, it's the other way around. We don't do anything without non-federal sponsor support. And what has happened on Long Beach Island is that a number of the towns have not been able to get the residents to grant them the easements necessary for the Corps of Engineers construction contractor to come and construct the dune, the beach and dune system on their property. So what you get on Long Beach Island are a number of places where there is the constructed project in place and a number of other places where the constructed project has not been constructed. And so this provided a sort of laboratory, a sort of controlled experiment when Sandy occurred to see just how effective these beach and dune projects are. And so right here is a description of what Philadelphia District, I believe they made this trip on December 17th, went to look at on Long Beach Island. And the principal places are Harvey Cedars, which is a town, Surf City, another town, and Brant Beach. And here I've got the same information in table form. In the left-hand column are the 13 different stops that they made. The ones that have green next to them are ones where the beach and dune project had been constructed. The ones that have red next to them are the ones where they had not been constructed. So you see, you get a nice, nice mix there, on, off. And what I got from Philadelphia District was a series of pictures that they took on that day. And you can see by comparing the pictures that are labeled 6 or 6A and 7 and 9, 10, and 11 with the ones from the green areas, which would be 1 through 5, and then 8, and then 12 through 13. So I'm not going to comment further. I'm just going to show you these pictures, and you'll be able to see, well, you decide what you see. Okay, where are the pictures? They're in the PDF file. Oh, I think I see it. Hold on. I think I got it. Yeah, here we are. So here's the appendix to the Philadelphia District report that has the site visit photos. And here is from area number 1, Harvey Cedars, where there was a project. Doesn't look too bad. I said I wasn't going to comment. Stop 3. 4, 5. Now there was something special about 6, wasn't there? Now we start to see some difference. There's 7. So let's see, 6 and 7 were red, right? So when we go to 8, we should start to see the change back. And here we are at 9. Lots of damage there, as you would expect. And then 12 and 13. So, anything anybody wants to ask? Not a thing, eh? That was all crystal clear. Yes, sir.
What was the,
Oh, wait a minute, I might be out of order. That's just a professor habit.
I think
Sorry
maybe
about
the
that.
question was maybe rhetorical for the time being, and we'll hold questions until, for a few minutes. So just bracket that thought for a few minutes, if you will.
Sorry about that, that's just a habit.
Okay, well, Tom, thank you very much. We'll move on down. I promise in just a few minutes we'll put these pictures back up on the screen in case anybody wants to refer specifically to them during the question and answer part of the panel discussion. So, Michel, I throw the floor over to you.
Yes, I'm going to talk about the mobilization of contaminants that occurred due to Hurricane Sandy. I joined NJIT last year, and as Dr. Cohen mentioned, I'm professor of civil and environmental engineering. I'm also director of the Center for Natural Resources Development and Protection. We work essentially on water quantity and quality and how that interacts with the society. We have worked on major oil spills, such as the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the Deepwater Horizon, which is the Gulf spill. I would like to acknowledge personnel in the center. They are in the room here, and they gave me much of the material that I'm presenting today, and they assisted me a lot in the research. I would like to acknowledge also Dr. Lisa Axe, because we used some facilities in her lab. As a center, we interact with different entities at NJIT. Some of them are in engineering. I am an engineer. I'm mostly in engineering, but we interact with centers of excellence at NJIT, such as the School of Architecture and their Center for Resilient Design. But also, we interact with entities outside of NJIT. Our goal is definitely to do research and provide, to add to knowledge. So we try to contribute to knowledge through publications, through findings, but also we wanna have research that makes an impact. So we wanna do practical research. So we actually wear the two hats. Sometimes we do very applied research, and other times we do very fundamental and very theoretical research. We're always looking for students to work with us, and we have hired in the past students from the Honors College. When Hurricane Sandy occurred, we got funding. We were one of the few universities that got funding from the National Science Foundation to evaluate the impact of Hurricane Sandy. We have some hypotheses to test. One of it was that the contaminants there are contaminants that are in different locations of the state, and maybe they are in some landfills, but when the hurricane came, it kind of suspended them and took them to places where they could cause more damage. That was one hypothesis we wanted to test. The other one was that the salinity from the sea kind of altered the ecology when it entered when it got inland. So we selected for our investigation a site in Raritan Bay, which is like 20 minutes south of here. You can see it on the right-hand side, Raritan Bay. And then we selected, if you zoom in, then you see that there was a river there called Cheesequake Creek. And we selected it for different reasons. Well, one, because the main reason is you have wetland and neighboring residential area. And in terms of the ecology, we care about the wetland. And in terms of public health, we definitely worry about residential areas. And as you can see on the bottom right, residential areas were flooded, but the whole area actually was flooded. We were there just, I would say, immediately after the hurricane subsided. There was some area that, still people pumping the water out of the streets. We had many students involved in this. These are our pictures. It was really, when they tell you had to be there, it is true. I was watching all the events on TV, and it didn't make it. Of course, TV could be very spectacular, but once you are there in person, it was really very devastating. You can see here, this area was flooded. These are residential areas. And these are some of this is the picture on the left. You can see a student Charlie is taking a core sample of sediments for analysis for contaminants. So let's bring it back. So what we have here, we have the yellow markers. These are where we did the sampling. So the bay is to the right. That's Raritan Bay. You have Transect. We call it Transect North, Transect South. We have sampling location in the residential area between the houses, in the front yard, in the backyard. And also we have one across kind of the pond, if you want to say, but it is in the wetland. And I'm going to report results from these areas. To make things more complicated, there is also a slag site. Essentially, they coat metals. They bring the ore, raw material, and then they transform it into metals. So there was a site there, and then it leached into the ground. So that's called now a Superfund site because the contamination is so great that you need a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with it. It has a lot of nasty stuff. So in our investigation, we wanted to see how that particular site affected the community. Now, we all worry about water quantity, but also we need to pay attention to water quality. So this is how the flooding occurred, at least we constructed it. So kind of a forensic reconstruction of what went on. So one more time, look at it, and then you see it entered from the cheesequake, but then also it entered from the back. Now, in that Superfund site, there was kind of a wall, and then it collapsed due to the hurricane. So when it collapsed, it releases chemicals and sediments from that site into the open water. So you can see these black dots on the right. And then we're still working on this. This is work in progress, but we're trying to figure out how they move. And now we are confident that this was the movement of the contaminants from the Superfund site into residential areas, but also into the wetland. This is just an illustration that after the water subsided, you have the sediments kind of settle down. So you have a lot of sediments coming from the seaside into residential areas and into the wetland. I'm going to talk about, so I mentioned a lot now about what happened on the surface, the water movement. But we are interested in a holistic understanding of the movement of chemicals. So now we're going to look what happens underground. We are going to see what happens below the ground surface. For that purpose, we are going to take a transect, kind of a cut. You can see it's AB. So we're going to cut in that area. And at the bottom here, let me see if I can see it. Here, you have water coming from the left. There's fresh water coming from inland because it rains, it brings fresh water. But that fresh water comes and interacts with the sea, so it rises up and down. So, but our goal is to understand how the salinity is affecting the wetland in this one. So this is just an illustration that we did it based on the. So the salinity essentially increased, and this is timed based on what happened in reality. This is not just to make it nice looking. We computed that based on the physics and the chemistry of the problem. So now you have a layer of high salinity onto a wetland that was not really saline. So let's just look at it this way. I mean, you have an environment that was not used to salt water, maybe used to salinity 10% of what that of salt water, of seawater, and now you covered it with seawater. That will have impact on the ecology. And then we conducted simulations. Maybe I'm going fast here, but the idea is the whole block is ground. Everything you see is underground. And then you have the horizontal is the horizontal distance, and then this is the depth. So on the right-hand side, you have the river. And the river goes up and down, not because it rains and doesn't rain, no. The water coming from up hills is relatively constant. But because when the tide rises, the whole water level rises. When the tide ebbs, then the whole water level drops. So we are trying to understand how the salinity in the wetland behaved how long it stayed. So, and taking into account the tidal influence. So you can see as the tide goes on up and down, you have the red part, the salinity, is actually getting diluted because now the hurricane has passed and then you have more fresh water coming from the land side. But on the other hand, you have evaporation taking its toll. So it is pretty complicated to fully account for it in this presentation. But the point I'm making here is that it is not, we need to consider the small scale processes, things that happen over minutes, to predict what happens over 3 months. That's what makes research in general challenging. This is a graph of the concentration of salt as a function of time in the wetland. So this is the salinity as it drops, as it decreases with time. After the hurricane, it was 25 grams per liter, which is kind of seawater. And then it took it about 2 months or maybe a month and a half for the salinity to return to its initial condition. And we were fortunate that we were able to simulate that, to predict that using our models. Now, this is the part that is, I would say, very challenging, very shocking. When we measured the contaminants, we measured the metals. Like, for example, in the bottom, center bottom, this is lead. Lead is a very nasty, toxic compound because it's a cumulative contaminant. Cumulative, it means when we take it in, we don't release it. It goes and ties into the bones. So if you get if you get exposed to lead when you are 10 years old and then 20 years later it accumulates in the body, it doesn't leave the body. There are other also equally toxic compounds such as, of course, arsenic, which is on the right. The background is that red line. Let's put it this way, it's like 1%, and then 1 ppm, 1 parts per million. And then following the hurricane, the concentration of lead increased up to 250 ppm. So it increased by 20,000 folds. So it didn't increase by double or 3 times. So the increase was really tremendous. Now this is in the wetland, but also we have the same contamination taking place in residential areas. So these are in people's yards. The level of contamination went up by 1,000 to 10,000 folds, from something that is below detection to concentrations that are definitely damaging to public health. We measure also nutrients, but I want to skip this. In conjunction with the National Science Foundation funding, we got recently funding from the state of New Jersey, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And the goal is the following. The state has asked numerous universities, different teams in different universities to design structures for flood mitigations. They ask us to work with these teams to have some kind of green engineering, because it's kind of relatively easy to build a concrete wall, right? I mean, it's not going to be that difficult to pour concrete. And the challenge is to have something that is, you get the community to buy in, something that is lasting, something that is resilient, and I will leave it to the expert to talk more about it, the next speaker. So the goal here is, I want to just briefly just mention some of the ideas that people are considering. Instead of just building major walls, you can rely on existing water to dampen the movement of the flood. Okay, so this is just an open space. You could have swamps, mangroves. You can have all kinds of systems. This is here, you have a honeycomb system that would dampen the movement of the wave, and it is visually appealing. This is just another example. where you can have a pathway for the dogs to walk around, that is definitely better than having a very steep seawall and very few people could access that area. And this is another stepped design. We are not saying these should be used. We're just saying that there's a lot of information out there in the literature. And we could work with different universities to bring these concepts to bear when designing flood mitigation structures. This is my favorite here. You have a system where it's kind of really green. The shrubs in the front, they are not really fully grown, but if you think they are fully grown, what would you get? You get some kind of ecological flux into the system, but also you get, it's aesthetically appealing. And in addition to that, if you have a big shrub and bushes, and then you have the flood wave coming, it will be dampened by them. So this is the case where nature works with you and for you rather than you just take an approach that is totally separated from nature. And of course, we would agree that we need to build resilient systems. We need to consider the constraints. If you go and build a wall in front of, for example, Manhattan, you're going to have a lot of objections from an economic point of view. You have a lot of businesses. We don't have the answer. We're just saying that we don't have the answer. We are saying that we need to bring all the stakeholders, and they are not only from engineering. They are with backgrounds that NJIT is actually producing. NJIT is teaching students in a variety. The reason that we are trying to develop a broad background for you is because engineering problems are not one-dimensional. We need to be aware of all of these issues. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, batting third in our lineup here this afternoon is Tom D'Alessio. So, Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you.
You want to close this? This is not yours, right?
Right.
Let's close this. And this is not yours. Okay, we don't want this.
No.
You want the Ethernet?
No, that's okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. We have to close them. Unless
No,
you're
no,
here.
it's right here. There we go. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Boufadel. First, thank you to Jay for organizing this activity and to Maury for introducing me. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Dr. Hodson. And we'll talk a bit about Long Beach Island. It's my second home, so I'd love to talk about that. I'm Tom D'Alessio. I have the privilege of being the director of the Center for Resilient Design and also to be an adjunct instructor at the College of Architecture and Design. I'm a land use planner by training, and so I teach land use planning and infrastructure planning, and I see a number of my students in the audience, as well as folks that I work with over the last year on various activities, so thank you all for being here. Today I'd like to use a number of visuals to help recount the activities post-Sandy, as well as anticipate the future of what resilient design could be, and how a place like NJIT could provide the perfect opportunity for laboratory testing of various policies and programs that are there. First, a little bit of history. Philip Johnson said one cannot not know history, so let's just go back a little bit. On November 30th, a number of us had the opportunity to actually survey some of the effects of Sandy. And this slide helps identify the resilience of New Jerseyans. We did survive Sandy. This is in Perth Amboy. Snooki's house survived, right? So we are stronger than the storm. We have an attitude, right? We are New Jersey. We are not going to let this sit. I don't know if it's the coffee or if it's our SUVs or whatever else we do, but we celebrate our resilience. And so when the president and the governor came to Asbury Park in May and declared that New Jersey is open for business, we all took it seriously, and hopefully a number of us went to the shore over the summer. A number of you students hopefully were down the shore, and if you haven't, it's supposed to be a beautiful weekend. Try and get down there, okay? But we saw situations such as the beach closings, and so we saw environmental degradation. We saw physical damage. This is a building in Perth Amboy that's up the hill from the Armory, which is up the hill from the Yacht Club. And that concrete structure that you see there actually had a building on it at one time, which is up the hill from the pier. And you see the building at the end of the pier. During Sandy, the water hit the base of that 14-foot elevation. That's coming from the river. That's not the ocean. Sandy also hit Seaside, as we know. Great devastation. And unfortunately, it did great damage. We lost businesses as well as homes, and some will never recover. In a place like Seabright, a very small community, this is devastating. Just for your information, we've been working in Seabright. They spent their year's budget just on debris removal alone. In a town with a little over 1,200 people, $6 million for a yearly budget for debris removal alone. Devastated. 90% of the downtown was devastated. But this is a more frightening sight and one that we need to contemplate. And for the social scientists and the folks who study the economy as well as the politics of things, this was Seaside Heights on November 30th. Ready for the holidays, but nobody around. Cordoned off because of Sandy. We need to anticipate situations like this and recover more quickly because this can have cataclysmic effects on all of us. And so a number of us went down to Seaside on November 30th. You see in the picture Darius Salahab, the director of the School of Architecture here at NJIT, myself, and the dean from Tulane University's College of Architecture came up and talked a bit about what are the things we can look for, what can we do. We made the newspaper, which is always cool. But what that also reminded me was for those of us who did not have power for a couple of days or a week, the newspaper became our source of information. And it helped us all better understand the consequences of the actions. I'm providing this information because I'll get to a point in a minute about what role you can play in resilience. I brought a number of Boy Scouts the next day, December 1st, down to Keansburg. And there's the motley crew. But this is the devastation. And if you may remember, 10 months ago, some of the conversation was all about, well, those are summer homes, those are beach homes, those are McMansions. We don't need to worry about that. This is 3 blocks from the river, the bay actually. Had never been flooded before, had to tear everything out. This is who that's for, working class communities. This is all about you. This is all about me. This is about what New Jersey is all about. And we need to figure out what resilient design is going to be because there will be another cataclysmic event. And we need to anticipate that, prepare, and recover more quickly. We brought up Dan Etheridge from City Center in New Orleans, gave us a number of ideas and suggestions. And I won't go through in detail some of the examples of their design build, but it helped inform the conversation of what does it mean to be resilient? What can architecture and engineering and planning and environmental science, computer science, all the other disciplines that you are engaged in, what role can you play in this conversation? Well, this is from New Orleans, and I don't suggest we do this, but this was the attitude. And in many parts of around the world, there is still this attitude. And unfortunately, in some parts of New Orleans, you still see this. This is Union Beach. It's not too far away. And so the concern is an entire block that was decimated by Sandy. What can we do? What should we be doing? These are homes that were affected. And if you see the home on the left, the blue line, that's where the water came. That's why FEMA is starting to recommend all these various elevations. But do those elevations make sense? Is it a community you want to live in? Is it a community you want to play in? One of the lessons we learned from the activities of City Center was to bring our activities to the community itself. And so in New Orleans, the architecture studios went right into the downtown and actually presented their materials, worked in the downtown on their ideas. They held open houses. They helped deconfuse green. We need to think about how to deconfuse resiliency. And I think Dr. Cohen started the conversation that I'd love to hear more about as we go through today. We created this Center for Resilient Design right after Sandy as a way for NJIT to give back. And you were all part of that. You need to help give back too. Dean Erzgoschat of the college asked me to lead this effort looking at 3 particular tools: applied research, field testing, and community outreach. I'll speak about a number of those activities in a minute, and some of you have been involved, but if you haven't, I ask you to think about how you can be involved in the future. How do we provide actionable 21st century, ready-to-build designs and expertise to our communities? We are the New Jersey Institute of Technology. How do we give back to our communities here in New Jersey? How do we help these communities recover and then save homeowners and businesses and towns money? We organized the alternative spring break, and I see a number of faces in the audience who were part of that activity. It was wonderful, and I'll talk a bit about it in a minute, but it does help inform how we actually design and rebuild after Sandy. Our studios and classes are also looking at how to develop resilient prototopologies. These designs and models for housing, mixed-use development, and public facilities and infrastructure at a range of scales and locations. And then last but not least, through our center, to establish a clearinghouse for information and contacts. Through a website, through roundtables, through lectures such as this. How do we bring the key players to the table, and how do we ensure that you students and faculty are engaged in the conversation? Our initial target areas were everywhere from the Jersey Shore through to our urban and suburban communities. We've been in Asbury Park and Seabright and Seaside Heights, as well as in Newark, Hoboken, Jersey City, and others cities, and in our suburban communities, all been affected. Our short-term goals are to complement the work that's already done. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? But we do need to build upon what's happening. And most importantly, how can we make your experience here at NJIT not only memorable, but also experiential and influential? How can the experiences you have here actually translate into a new job, a new career, maybe perhaps a new product, a new patent? Where are the opportunities for solutions? So, as I said, we did this alternative spring break, and some of you may see your picture in here, everywhere from in Newark down to Beach Haven. It was a formative experience, and that's why I showed the picture about the Boy Scout activity a couple of months before. Having you folks in the communities, getting to know the communities, getting to know the officials, the residents, why things happen, what makes a town click, matters. You're not helicoptering in and helicoptering out. You're not just studying in a classroom. You're actually making a difference. And so we had over 600 volunteers and 22 colleges and universities, various projects, 3,500 person hours completed. I'm thrilled to say that you made an impact, and I'm also very proud to say we're starting to plan for 2014. So put that on your calendar for the alternative spring break. We'll do some great things. Secondly, we organized roundtables, and there are some lessons from these roundtables I'd like to share with you, because part of today's conversation is all about what can we learn. What can you students share with us? What can faculty, in particular, share with others? Everything from design to regulations to presentations. One presentation came from a builder in Hoboken and started talking about how do you build resiliently in a floodplain. And so he looked at the FEMA maps, and a lot of this was his own research. What is the importance of design in flood areas in particular, and how can we do things differently? What have we learned using the FEMA maps and other information? What happens if you have a flood elevation of 14 feet? What does it mean for residential or commercial structures? How do you deal with a brownstone if you have to raise a structure 14 feet? Critical challenges we need to start thinking a bit about. What about materials in particular? And he was looking at autoclaved aerated concrete. What are the opportunities through the materials and different designs to provide features and benefits that are resilient? How about looking at the FEMA regulations? If you're in a V zone where you're looking at velocity issues and challenges and coastal construction, what can we learn from all of that? And here's the bottom line. This is not a FEMA person, with all due respect, or a person from the Army Corps or a person from NJIT. This is a person in business who has said the cost is going to be in the billions and we must act now. Critically important, and I think all of you need to join in that clarion call. Secondly, we had one of our faculty members, the chair of the graduate department, Keith Grumwoody, give a presentation on the work that he had done previously in New York and how, in particular, infrastructure systems can be more resilient and how that infrastructure renewal can actually redevelop and renovate and help communities actually in the redevelopment process. And if you have questions, I'll just ask you to come see Keith afterwards. Keith, if you could raise your hand so people recognize. Okay. Make those connections. Another Resilient Dine roundtable went through the whole question of what are the actual regulations. And so we brought in an attorney and planners. And I encourage, particularly you students, to get a wealth of information, to listen to the folks who understand and implement policy, as well as those who might write the laws and the regulations. They went through some of the critical challenges that we have to face, and their basic point was that these regulations are changing and how difficult it is for planners and architects and engineers to work in communities when we've gone from advisory-based flood elevations to preliminary flood elevations to what we anticipate will be draft final and final elevations. And when they start changing, they go from 15 to 8 to 7 to 4. What does that do to a community? Last but not least, our last roundtable addressed the whole issue of student work. And this is what I'm frankly most proud of, and I'd like to just share with you. A number of students contributed incredibly, and we will be posting these on our website. I have a couple of the faculty in the audience, and in particular, I'll ask Martina Decker to raise her hand. Martina's studio dealt with emergent materials and reactive environments. Really cool stuff, right? How to deal with nanotechnology and materials, making opportunities actually for communities that might not think about these ideas to move forward. And so the challenge in a place like Seabright was, if you're going to rebuild the seawall, what are the opportunities? And if one need of that community is a bathhouse or changing facilities, something like that, how can you incorporate that into the seawall and perhaps use materials? And so Adam contemplated the idea of building a seawall that people would like to see. If you have a 15-foot seawall, in many cases it's brick, concrete, rock structure. How do you make it a place that's experiential, that matters? And so Adam went through the process basically of starting saying, what would it look like to build this seawall? And what would the experience be as we go through? And how do you use that opportunity to actually make a place like Seabright even better? And so his idea, as he was moving forward, was let's start looking at various materials. And one of the materials that he identified in particular was the polymers that could actually capture the energy from the sun during the day and then light the seawall during the night. So you could actually walk on the seawall, make it an experience that actually could be energized by the sun, making Seabright Seabright. That's the kind of thinking that you students can bring to the communities and what we really need. Anna put together a whole idea of use the water and the heat to possibly create steam baths and use the seawall, create an experience that people could actually want to be at. And then Anton took it to the 25th century, although all of these materials are available today, right? Seems like a scene out of Star Wars. But contemplating the fact that Seabright may in 50, 100, 150 years be underwater with sea level rise, how do you start contemplating a place like Seabright and where we should be? Anton's idea was that we start looking at communities in pods and that these communities actually become self-sufficient, that they're over the water on hydraulics, and that these hydraulic piers raise and lower with the water, that that energy action actually powers the entire system. And that's sustainable and resilient. So we start getting to the idea of how do we use materials? Another studio, Matt Burgermaster put together on precast concrete. How do you use this for opportunities for plasticity and for resilience in a place like Long Branch, where the flooding actually happened in between the ocean and the downtown? How do you connect the downtown to the oceanfront area? And one student looked in particular at the idea of creating a whole new structure. You raise the platform, and that becomes the place where the pedestrian movement happens, where the infrastructure happens, and where you glom buildings on top, next to it. So if you have to raise a structure 15, 20 feet, all of a sudden it's now at eye level. And then look at the idea of using various materials, creating different opportunities, perhaps a farming wall, perhaps urban gardens, green roofs, ways to capture the water before it actually even gets to the ground. And then last but not least, the whole conversation about the loss of property. We had heard over the conversations that in the first 3 to 4 months in New Jersey, insurance companies paid the greatest payout to lost cars. We lost 12,000 cars in New Jersey, just in Sandy alone. And so the point was, how do we deal with that? And if we want to build a parking garage or structure, can we make it resilient? And within that, maybe an emergency management office, maybe an opportunity for recreation, maybe a garage, and then using things, materials like precast concrete, make it a place we want to be, right? A really interesting place. Susan Bristol went through a whole conversation with her class about a new facility for Bayhead, a borough hall. She took her students to the February council meeting, and at that February council meeting, the council decided actually they needed to build a new borough hall. So all of a sudden, it became real, right? So they looked through the site, they looked from Corbusier to FEMA, and actually looked at various techniques, transportation, landscape, land and water management, various building materials, and came up with a design that looks like it's always been there, and yet 21st century and resilient. A second student went through a whole presentation on a pier structure and creating a building of that nature. We had a faculty member, Georgine Theodore, go through a whole infrastructure seminar on boroughs and resilient regions. And in Hoboken in particular, looking at what are the vulnerabilities in mapping these various areas, and what are the proposed plans. And then last but not least, Keith Crumwoody's studio over the summer looked at housing in particular in Union Beach and Seabright, anticipating water-related events, everything from amphibious housing, where the home is on a platform that could raise or lower with water levels, to future vision Seabright, where Benazir and Ashman, I apologize, actually came up with a design that is now in the 3C competition. And the idea that you would actually live on the second, third, and fourth levels, connecting directly to the seawall and moving forward, and that activities would happen. So in conclusion, we're anticipating outcomes, we're trying to understand these conditions, testing the various policies, designing these prototypes, and imagining new ideas for materials. What are our lessons? And this gets to Maury's point about how to move from sustainable to resilient. 3 fundamental questions in my mind. What went right? Start with the positive. A lot of things went right. What went wrong? What did we do that we should have done differently? And what almost went wrong? And this is the question that should be keeping you up at night. What's the one thing if it happened a little bit differently, we would have been in much more trouble? Such as, suppose we had had the foot of rain here in this area that they predicted, like we did in Irene, what would have happened there? What are we protecting, people or property or both? How are we maximizing or optimizing the goals? What risks are we willing to accept? Is managed retreat, the idea we're just going to abandon places, really an option in certain communities? And then last but not least, what storm are we prepared for? Is it Sandy, Irene, Katrina, or Floyd? How do you live with water? And this is the final point to leave with you. You could be in Iowa. You could be in Kansas, right? You're here in New Jersey. You're here for a reason. We like the connection to the water, and we don't want to abandon it. So how do we make the opportunities? How do we use new materials to address natural disasters? And last but not least, how do we leave our children and our grandchildren with a better plan B? And to me, that's the definition of resiliency. So I encourage you to go to our website, centerforresilientdesign.org. Come see me, come see our faculty and staff if you have the opportunity to collaborate, because I think it's a really important opportunity. I'm convinced that the unfortunate events of Sandy are going to transform the industry and your professions the way a decade ago the unfortunate events of 9/11 transformed the way we think of security. Resilient design will be on the tip of everyone's tongues in a couple of years. You will be at the cutting edge. Thank you.
Well, Tom, thank you very much, and thanks to all 3 speakers. I think we've had a fascinating sort of collage or montage ranging from policy planning to environmental science and engineering to the social, architectural, educational dimensions and some of the lessons learned over the past 11 and a half months. This is the point in the program where we throw things over to you all. So I think there's somebody running with a microphone. Jay is our speedy, 2 microphones. So if what we'll do is anybody who would like to pose a question, we'll try to keep things orderly. I'll direct traffic the best I can. Please wait until you have a microphone in working order in hand because the event is being filmed, and the only way to capture your question for posterity is to have a working microphone close to your mouth. So questions for any of our speakers, and please do indicate at the start to whom you are addressing your question. And we'll move along like that for about 20 or 25 minutes with the intention of finishing up by 4:30.
Thank you. This is to all 3 of you. have any of the previous designs, considering the North Sea Wall in the Netherlands and their previous experiences with bad flooding, have those events influenced you at all when it comes to design or prevention or even elimination of contamination?
Tom over here, and then we'll work our way
Yeah,
down.
there's no design alternative that's excluded, and we've been in touch with a lot of officials from the Netherlands for actually quite a long time, mostly starting with Katrina, the immediate post-Katrina period. So, no, there's absolutely no design that is off the table. What we do in planning is compare and contrast them in terms of cost and benefit. So it has to be, you gotta have some kind of cost estimate. You guys, right. Has to be a basis for a cost estimate.
Yeah, I agree. We talked with the General Council of the Netherlands, actually, and on November 18th, we're going to have a conference where we're going to bring, the General Council of the Netherlands, but other European entities because of their experience. But yeah, I agree, nothing is off the table.
We actually had the opportunity to work with folks from the Netherlands, the Hudson 500 group, through the H209 forum at the beginning of this month. And one of the interesting observations from that, and we had the opportunity, actually, Martina and Keith were there with a number of our students, was to compare and contrast the American model with the Dutch model, if you will. The American model exemplified here in New Jersey, where we basically are addressing individual concerns, and the Dutch model where they actually look at community infrastructure going through. And so we had representatives from the Deltares and the Dutch Delta Commission actually present their work, a new report from the Dutch Delta Commission just out, talking about how actually to address those challenges. One way they're looking at in particular is to not throw sand directly on the dune, actually start in the middle of the North Sea and work their way up. And looking at it from a holistic opportunity, and here's the punchline. They've done analysis to understand that if they did nothing in the Netherlands, 90% of the Netherlands would be underwater today. We need to contemplate the effects of sea level rise and think about where we're going to be without community actions.
While we're teeing up the next question, I'll just observe I was on the Dutch island of Texel, one of the northern barrier islands in the months following Hurricane Sandy, and it was quite impressive to stand on the landward side of a seawall and have the North Sea be about 6 or 8 feet over your head. Rather disconcerting experience, to say the least, but based on my own work and familiarity with the Dutch academic community, the problems that Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy have thrown up have been rather extraordinary work-producing events for Dutch hydrogeologists and others. Another question over here on the left.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me? Okay. My name's Steve Mayman, and my company is Summit Reliance Group. We're hoping to get engaged with the Center for Resilient Design soon. We are a disruptive platform technologies company focused on disaster reconstruction and infrastructure development and construction. We bid a concrete, precast concrete panel, structural panel boardwalk for Seaside Heights, but they got wrapped up in cost and they got wrapped up in wood. And we also have developed a concept for a mobile artificial sand dune, which could be put up very quickly, taken down. There are a lot of things. So we're looking at very innovative approaches to the problems we're discussing here, but also with the concept of being able to handle the cost issues and the practicality of it. So somewhere we'd like to be able to talk with you and your teams about how we bridge that component of it. There are a lot of designs that are very attractive, but are just not going to see the light of day in the real world because of cost and other problems. Is there a Corps of Engineer guy here? Okay, sir. There was an event here, I guess a month or so ago at NJIT, where they were talking, people could come in and talk to people about Sandy, and there was one construction company here. Everybody else was like AT&T and banks and all that, but the Corps of Engineer guy told us that the Corps of Engineer was not interested in any innovations, that they were interested only in doing what was available out there and what they were told to do. I'd like to hear some comment on that.
Well, sounds to me like whoever that was is probably not connected with the Sandy project or didn't understand the question, because it's just not true.
Okay, next. Come on, you guys got to pose questions, otherwise I seize the priority and start posing them myself.
Hi, this is also for all three of you. What kind of work is being done on the electricity infrastructure? Because a lot of the problems happen because of electric poles that have fell down. Is there anything new that's going to come out for that, or any way to work with that?
The answer is yes. I know the governor's office in particular is keenly interested in the issue of energy provision. I can report back to you that we've been meeting with folks in the governor's office on some energy challenges and opportunities moving forward. If you'd like to know more about it, I suggest you take a look at some of the work that's already being done with New Jersey Transit and the Federal Department of Energy. They're looking at a microgrid system to see if transit operations could actually be powered on a microgrid. I can also refer you to the city of Hoboken, which has applied to the federal government for an opportunity to actually develop a microgrid in a community in Hoboken. One of their major challenges was most of the western end of Hoboken was flooded. That's where all of their energy systems are. And so part of the issue obviously is water. Some of the issue also gets to the issue of wind damage. And also, you may remember a week after Sandy hit, snows came. And so we had fallen branches and trees and stuff going through. It's an extensive challenge. The Board of Public Utilities is looking at that. And we at the Center for Resilient Design are looking to actually partner to come up with comprehensive solutions on that. And we think, again, at a place like NJIT, working with Dr. Boufadel's center and with others here in engineering and computer sciences, we're uniquely suited to address some of these challenges. It will take some money, but I think we've seen, especially over the last 9 months, that the cost of prevention is much less than the cost of recovery. And so the question is, how do we get to that point?
And from the core planning perspective, our benefits essentially come from bad things that are prevented in the with project condition. So we could count preventing those outages and the consequences of those outages as a project benefit as long as we can plausibly quantify them, with the emphasis on plausibly. You know, you can quantify almost anything if you allow me a big enough confidence interval. But what happens is that opponents of projects and opponents of bearing the tax burden of doing these expensive sorts of things start attacking the Corps' analysis on the basis that, well, the Corps doesn't know that, they may think that, but really they're just making this up. So it becomes an issue of how plausibly can you quantify things. And the Corps of Engineers will very often decide that the benefit is not worth the fight, not worth the political cost.
And this is where leadership comes in. And if I can take my hat off on the center and my former hat of leadership to say, each of you need to make sure that you have the government, not only you pay for, but the government you want and the leadership that you want. And if you don't like what you're hearing, you should do something about that.
Why don't we take this one here, and then we'll move over to the other side of the room.
Do the towns near the shore that didn't have the sand dunes, are they more inclined now to go ahead with those projects, or are they still holding back because it's destroying their view of the beach?
I presume that was directed to...
Yes.
There are mixed reactions, and even mixed reactions from one part of a town to another part of a town. You've got Mantoloking, which is so desperate to do something that they're engaging in self-help. we're not prepared to wait for the Corps of Engineers and their 65 cents on the dollar. They're going ahead with their own project. But at the same time, they're inquiring of Philadelphia District how they can get what they spend on their own project credited to some subsequent Corps of Engineers project. So you've got people all over the map. You've got people who would like to be paid by the government to go someplace else. You've got Governor Cuomo, who has offered in Staten Island to pay 110% of the pre-Sandy free market value of your residence in Staten Island if you'll move away from the flood zone, and 115% if you'll move away from the flood zone to someplace else in Staten Island. So that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are, as I say, mantaloking, who are going ahead with self-help. So it's all over the place.
You alluded to this problem earlier with the Dunes project, but New Jersey's a place where local control is important. So if you go up and down that coast, every town has its own ordinances. Every town has an idea of what should be done. And then there's obviously on top of that the state and the federal ordinances and various and sundry laws and regulations. How are you going to get the towns together to really agree on some solutions that are common between the various towns? And I know one thing is talk to people, but you know, I'm chairman of our local planning board, so I know how some of those issues go. I mean, there needs to be something other than Governor Christie, who says we're going to take you to court if you don't do this, but there's got to be some solution to getting people together in agreement at a town level on what needs to be done. Suggestions on how that might be done.
Maybe we'll let Tom at the end take that one, and then we'll move Tom to my immediate right.
We very much agree with you on that effort. And I will tell you, as a former local elected official and member of my planning board, I've lived that experience. What I've seen, though, over the last 9-12 months is really an interesting change in local municipal attitude. By way of example, when Governor Christie signed the executive order requiring every town to follow FEMA regulations, he in effect overrode local zoning, right? Basically said everyone's going to follow these flood elevations, and some towns grumbled, other towns thought it was a good idea. Fast forward 6 months, and the mayor of Brick Township basically said at a public meeting, when the new preliminary maps come out, I want the governor to sign a new executive order because we want to follow that. And so it's interesting, you're starting to hear mayors recognize that they need to have other towns cooperate and understand that there needs to be some consistency in going through this. I'll use one more example. We've been working in the town of Seabright, which lost not only their business in their downtown, but also most of their public facilities, including their library. The town just next door, Monmouth Beach, also lost most of their facilities, including a library, literally spitting distance of each other. You start to think a bit about the cost of building a new library for two towns that you could walk from one to the other, and start thinking about what's the opportunity. So the mayor of Seabright is actually looking at issues of sharing services to potential consolidation with other towns. I think the fiscal realities of post-Sandy New Jersey are going to require towns to be more consistent with that. And we're happy to help through studios and classes have local officials understand the options that are available to them.
Well, you've put your finger on a very big problem. And I'll give you a non-Sandy example to keep from criticizing anybody directly or indirectly. And that's the Passaic. Let's see, the first state study of the Passaic River flooding was in 96. That's 1796. The Corps of Engineers got the fluvial flood control mission in 1936. The Passaic was one of the first things we were asked to work on. We have been to final feasibility 5 separate times. We've even had an authorized project, a project authorized by Congress in WRDA 1990, Water Resources Development Act of 1990. And still, there has been no construction. And why is that? It's exactly the problem that you put your finger on. It is not just non-federal sponsor consent, but local consent. Most non-federal sponsors require local consent and require a sub-cost-sharing agreement. We'll have a cost-sharing agreement with the non-federal sponsor, but that's contingent on their having sub-agreements with localities. And yes, it's very, very difficult to get those stars to align. I can give you another example. Fire Island to Montauk Point. That project was authorized for construction in 1960. I'm still working on it because, well, a lot of reasons. Having almost nothing to do with the engineering or the economics of it, put it that way.
I'm going to go to Professor Nelson on the my left, and then we'll come down to the front here.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for having this as a focus. But I have to make just a few little introductory comments. I've been going back and forth across the Hudson River, meeting with various organizations, and it seems to me a couple of things. One, that New York is doing its thing, ignoring New Jersey in many respects, and vice versa. And it doesn't make any sense. And more than that, politically, we also have it in terms of there must be 20 or 25 companies that were all involved in power in the area hit by Sandy. And they're all involved in doing their own independent response to Sandy. And there isn't any sense of anything being optimized regionally. So I think that the question becomes, while we're all trying to locally respond and look resilient from the local personal perspective, I have absolutely no security that there really is the broad look at the region and what's going to happen when something other than the last hurricane comes, which might be quite different. So it seems to me, even from an engineering standpoint or from a science standpoint, we should be able to stretch beyond what the political difficulties are and address the thing regionally rather than locally.
Did you have somebody in particular in mind that you wanted to handle that one, Priscilla?
When you talk with Dutch officials, they find our difficulties, like the ones I just described, incredible. And then I ask them, let's see, the Netherlands, that's a unitary state, isn't it? And they say yes. And the United States, that's a federal state. Yes. And what does that mean? It means it multiplies the different layers of authority and decision-making. And so, okay, the difficulties of getting to consent rise exponentially. They're not additive. Moreover, the structure, the structure of non-federal sponsor consent means that in the normal study, the biggest thing you can look at is what your non-federal sponsor cares about. Now, in the case of deep draft navigation, we have as our non-federal sponsor the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which was the creation of an interstate compact in 1921. And they don't make any big distinction between New York and New Jersey, and so you get to look at it in a regional way. But in other contexts, our biggest non-federal sponsor geographically is New York State DEC. There are some people talking about an interstate compact for Sandy in order to make sure that things are looked at in that sort of regional way, in order to maximize the opportunity to use economies of scale, to do something really, really big. But until that happens, we're stuck with the political structure that we have.
Michal, and then Tom? No? Okay. Okay, well, I'm sure Tom will be, is enthusiastic to respond, so I'm not going to stand in his way.
Thank you. The social scientists, I think, will find it fascinating years from now to analyze the leadership styles and the effects of the actions in New York City, New York State, and New Jersey vis-a-vis Sandy. In particular, looking at the decisions made by Governor Cuomo, Governor Christie, and Mayor Bloomberg. And I think there are a number of lessons that we can learn from that. What I can also say is I've been privileged over the last 2 months to be part of the Rebuild by Design competition research advisory group. And so I've been able to provide advice to 10 teams from around the world that are looking at what are the opportunities in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan region. A number of those teams are looking at regional solutions. The good news is that Secretary of HUD, Sean Donovan, has made a commitment of a couple $2 billion to actually build some of these solutions that these design teams are coming up with. So part of my charge has first been to remind folks that there is a New Jersey and there are needs and solutions on this side of the river. And secondly, to say how that can fit into a metropolitan solution so that if we do something in New Jersey that's hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure, make sure that we do no harm to New York City or to the rest of New York and vice versa.
Okay, I think we'll make one more from down front here, and then we'll draw things to a close.
This is, I think it piggybacks on the last two, but for the Corps, when Tom and I were down in Seabright for the H209 forum, the representative from the Corps was talking about the cost-benefit structure and how projects are essentially, whether they go forward is determined through that. And interestingly was describing sort of the structural versus a non-structural solution, or let's say the consolidated regional solution versus the individual property owner solution. And that is, at a certain point, if a community, enough houses were elevated, it would obviate the need through the cost-benefit structure to do, let's say, a community-wide project that the Corps would be doing. Could you describe that a little bit? Am I right in my interpretation of what he said? And how does that play out in terms of how you plan projects? Because that's always a variable that you can't predict, I wouldn't think.
Were you talking to Bob Seltzer? Or
Tom, do you remember his name? It's a young, really sharp young engineer
Oh, and it
with the
wasn't
Corps.
Bob's my age. That's a theoretical possibility. By non-structural, and it's a very odd term, by non-structural, what is meant is dealing with individual buildings. It could be raising the building in the sense of making it higher. It could be raising the building in the sense of R-A-Z-I-N-G, raising the building, buying out the land, moving people away. It could be flood-proofing measures. Those are all classified as non-structural to make them distinct from the beach and dune type of project, the seawall type of project, the long linear type of project. Here's the big economic difference between them. The non-structural doesn't have any economies of scale. You do them one by one by one. The linear structural project can have enormous economies of scale. And so what usually happens is this. A non-structural project is more likely to be economically justified where the population and building density is low. Places like the Red River of the North, remember when that flooded a few years ago? And you have an average of about one building per square mile. And in those kinds of places, the dealing with individual buildings can actually be less expensive and more powerful on a cost-benefit basis than, for instance, a levee or flood wall. Around here, where the population density and the density of buildings and infrastructure is much higher, it's very unlikely that you're going to, it has happened, but it's very unlikely that a non-structural project will outperform structural projects on a cost-benefit basis. So, did I answer the question, or?
Well, he was expressing concern that in some of these small towns that was happening.
All right, I see what you mean.
Like a small town, like with people rushing to elevate their houses, at a certain point, if I don't know what the number, he gave an example, like if 30% of the people get their houses elevated, the structural solution
Okay.
is no longer necessary.
That's a slightly different but related issue, and it has to do with the kind of self-help I was talking about earlier. And yes, indeed, it's entirely possible for individual action to so reduce the benefit pool that a structural solution no longer is economically justified. It's entirely possible. And it's something that I'm very, very concerned about. Again, let's take the Passaic case. There are a number of programs that are designed and periodically are funded to buy out flood-prone structures. So you buy them out, you tear down the structure, you rip out the underground infrastructure, and turn it into parkland. Well, okay. But what you've done is you've reduced the benefit pool for some levee flood wall. And you do enough of that, and it's entirely possible to make any kind of structural solution not economically justified. And our regulations don't allow us to recommend things that aren't economically justified. Now, Congress has authorized things knowing full well that they weren't economically justified. But that takes some special language and some special political might to get it done. So yeah, that's a theoretical possibility, and one that I'm very worried about in a lot of places, most prominently the Passaic.
So as it's often the case, we'll allow the Army Corps to have the final word here. And I'll just finish up by thanking the three panelists for their insights and for joining us here today. Thanks to all of you for your attention, for your questions, and hope to see you again at a future forum event.